Welcome back. Over the next week, we'll be dealing with two events that form the backbone or the center, if you will, of the Christian faith: Jesus' death and Jesus' resurrection. Your first set of readings and videos will cover the issue of Jesus' death. And we have a few readings this week and a few videos. This will take you a little bit more time, but you will get double the credit for these this week. So I hope that you will set aside some time to think about these very important and deep and significant issues. So when we talk about Jesus' death, Christians often ask the question, why did Jesus have to die? And often we come up with theological answers. For instance, it was God's purpose that Jesus died. Jesus died to save us. But when we often think about it, we rarely ask the question, why did humans want to kill Jesus? Our first two readings from the Gospel in Salentiname feature some campesinos talking about, number one, the trial, Jesus' trial before Pilate, who was a Roman authority. And number two, the crucifixion, where we actually find Jesus dying at the hands of the state. Now, what we find the campesinos talking about is the issue of those in power versus those who do not have power, and why perhaps Jesus was a victim. Again, asking, what do humans have to do with this part of the equation? Now, as we move on, we're going to look at two other readings. Number one, The Cross and the Lynching Tree by James Cone, of which you'll also see a video of him talking about this very animatedly. And number two, Why Did Jesus Have to Die? Suffering, Election, and the Atonement by Bob Ekblad. Now the first one, The Cross and the Lynching Tree by James Cone. James Cone is an African-American theologian who's very noted for asking questions about what the African-American experience teaches us about the Christian faith. And his most recent book is called The Cross and the Lynching Tree, where he takes two very prominent symbols of death and torture. Number one, the cross, the Roman instrument of torture 2,000 years ago that was used to kill Jesus. And then number two, the lynching tree, which notably was used in the American South during the Civil Rights era to oppress and to kill African Americans. And James Cone asks what these two symbols of torture and oppression might have to do with each other, which again is pushing us to think beyond the terms of God's purpose in these events, but to think more in terms of what does it mean that Jesus was a victim of violence, and how might that connect with African Americans and their victimization at the hands of white Southerners just within the past century in our own country. The next reading, Why Did Jesus Have to Die? Suffering, Election, and Atonement by Bob Ekblad, comes from his phenomenal book called Reading the Bible with the Damned. And Bob Ekblad is working out of the Pacific Northwest in the state of Washington, and he works primarily with inmates. And in this particular case, he does Bible studies with the inmates and gets their perspective on it. And here he is working actually with some death row inmates. People who in our day and age are facing a similar circumstance as Jesus did 2,000 years ago. Their death is impending, and they are reflecting on God's role in this as well as their own role as victims. And so as we reflect on these particular readings, I want you again to ask the question, why did Jesus have to die? Not just in God's mind, but in the process of human history, humans decided that Jesus needed to die. Why was that? What was it about him? And what can we learn about that? Often we think about certain metaphors that we use to describe Jesus' death. Sometimes we talk about Jesus' death as a ransom that was paid for us. Jesus was a substitution on behalf of us. Or often Jesus was an example through his death and suffering. But this week's readings will challenge us to think of Jesus as a victim, somebody victimized by violence. And we'll ask the question, if the Jesus we meet on the cross is a victim of human and state-sanctioned violence, what light might that shed on those who are victims of state-sanctioned violence today? Finally, your videos. One is James Cone, again, reiterating some of the themes about the cross and the lynching tree. And I hope you will take the time to view this because you will see a passion and a charisma in Dr. Cone that help you catch the ideas he is trying to share with us. But the second video is especially important, and it's called The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. And in this, author Michelle Alexander talks about the ideas in this book right here, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in an Age of Color Blindness, which is one of the biggest problems in our society today. As it turns out, African American males are at a much higher likelihood of being jailed in our country than anybody else, and at a much higher percentage and rate per capita than whites, Hispanics, Asians, anybody else. And we're creating a very big problem. And the question is, how might this relate to Jesus and his suffering, his imprisonment, and his suffering at the hands of the state? Right? So now we have many people in our country, partially because of their color skin, partially because they are poor, who are facing suffering at the hands of our state penitentiary system. And I want you to really wrestle with the idea, are these two events connected? Is there something in Jesus' death that perhaps informs our world today and how we understand the plight of those who are suffering in our jails today? So these are pretty challenging ideas. I know that you are highly capable of wrestling with these ideas and struggling with them and asking good questions. And I look forward to being a part of that process with you.